It's summertime, and I'm standing in the public cafeteria at the Urban Outfitters building at the Philly Navy Yard, where I worked at that time. The cafeteria that a lot of the Navy Yard employees ate at, which by 2019, the Navy Yard was a full-blown business center with corporate companies and a strong Navy presence. Normally, I'd have taken my lunch outside. That's just what most people did in the summertime down there. Find a spot outside and eat while the weather was good. But that day I was inside. It was also raining. And to give some context, the Navy Yard, especially this particular cafeteria, that it's public and it's owned by Urban Outfitters, and they have Anthropologie and all their other, like, their Free People, all those brands. The Navy, that particular cafeteria was this weird but also like great mixture of people: engineers, designers, fashion people, straight up nerds, all grabbing lunch in the same room. Jack and I were both engineers, badge swiping into the same slice of that world. And in the middle of all that, on a completely ordinary day with a lunch crowd around us, I handed him back my engagement ring. Not at a restaurant, not some big moment, just a cafeteria, because that's where we were that day, and I couldn't carry that ring around for one more hour. He takes it, doesn't say much. I walk back to my desk like nothing had happened. Because just one floor up, people are still mid-meeting, mid-sandwich, completely unaware that I just officially called off a wedding. That's where the story ends. I want to tell you how it started, because it didn't start with a bad guy. It started with me being 25, exhausted, and really, really good at ignoring my own instincts. 2 years prior to this cafeteria situation, my apartment in Philly had burned down. Not a metaphor, actual fire. I lived in a 4-story walk-up and written house, and it was, I don't know what happened. I think it might have been arson, but I was on a work trip and I got a text from my friend, and she's like, "Hey, there's a massive fire in Philly and it kind of looks like near your house or near your apartment building." And I was like, okay, whatever. And then later that day, I get an email from our landlord, and he was like, "Everything's fine, but it's like serious damage and the whole building is trashed and you need to move out." So that was like really, that was a lot. And I got really fortunate though, because most of my belongings just had smoke damage compared to some of the other tenants. Like there was someone on the first floor who was an artist, and like all of their stuff was trashed, and they were an art student and everything was ruined. So I really lucked out. And I decided, so I moved back in with my parents until I could get my life a little bit together and find another place. And that's its own special kind of humbling when you've been living independently and paying your own rent. But my parents, I have a great relationship with them, so they really came through for me. At the same time, I was an engineer working like mid-level, trying to prove myself in rooms where I usually was the only woman and often the youngest person by a decade or two. And I liked my job. I was good at it and I enjoyed the projects that I was working on. But everything outside of work felt like it was on fire, literally and figuratively. Then I met a guy. And for the purposes of this story, I will call him Jack. We technically worked for the same organization, different floors, different departments, but all within the same building. I was on the first floor, or no, he was on the first floor and I was on the second floor. And I'd known him virtually for a bit. He was working on a project down in Florida. So for months, he was just this name on emails and a voice on calls. Then one night, I attended a young professionals happy hour. He walks in, tall, red hair, a man bun. He wore like it was a personal philosophy and a religion. And just enough I surf during hurricanes, bad boy energy to make it interesting. We bonded over Daft Punk, of all things. I'm a huge fan of Daft Punk. And he was like, oh my God, Random Access Memories. And I was like, oh my God, I love it. Album, it's so great. Then we started texting. First day was at a garden. It was cute. It was easy. And here's the part I didn't understand yet. My life was chaos. And he felt like the opposite of that. Calm, steady, like the universe handing me a reset button right when I needed one. I really want to be honest about something here because I think it applies to a lot more than just relationships. So when your life feels unstable, anything steady can feel like destiny or it's meant to be. And your brain can't always tell the difference between this is right for me and this is a relief. And at 25, fresh off losing my apartment, I was going through some other shit, like mental health things that I'll get into someday. I didn't really have a lot to compare to because when you're that young, you're not quite experienced yet. So like, how could you know, you're not an expert at life at that point. You're figuring your shit out. So I didn't question it. I just leaned into it. So Jack was 5 years older than me and obviously like further along in his career. From the beginning, there was a dynamic. He was kind of more of like the teacher and I was more the student. And look, in engineering, in any technical field, you get used to that structure. Someone more senior shows you the ropes. You learn. It's very normal at work. The problem is when that dynamic doesn't stay at work. And it started small. He had opinions about everything. And slowly his opinions became my defaults. Not because he demanded it, because I let it happen. I was a person who, at work, was starting to push back on things during like a design review, questioning assumptions, holding my ground with people that were twice my seniority. And at home with him, I just didn't. I didn't operate like that. I let his voice become the loudest one in the room, including the room in my own head. And I didn't realize any of this was happening in real time. Like you never do. You notice it later when you look back and you realize you can't remember the last time that you trusted your own gut on something that mattered. So about a year in, a woman that I knew in the office and someone who'd known Jack for years before I did and knew all his like questionable life choices mentioned something to me very offhand, like she was casually kind of chatting about the weather. She said he once dated someone who wasn't even old enough to drink. I remember standing there just going like, I'm sorry, what? But I didn't really ask a lot of follow-up questions. I didn't let myself sit with it. I liked him. I wanted this to work. So I did what a lot of us do. I filed it away in the back of my mind under the deal with this later and just kept it moving. And when I eventually brought it up to him, I was testing the water like kind of gently. He gave me this confused look and just said, well, she didn't tell me how old she was. No accountability, just a shrug. And I remember he was like starting to badmouth this woman who told me about this. And that was also a red flag, but I just let it go. Because when you're trying to really hard to make something work, you get really skilled in like deciding when things are okay. But they're not. They're so not. Fast forward 2 years into the relationship. Jack wanted to buy a house. Okay, cool. That's fine. He's allowed to do whatever he wants. He's a grown adult. He was in his 30s and I was 25. And I wasn't ready to buy a house. Like I was still like, I loved living in the city. I liked living in my apartment. I was traveling a lot for work. I wasn't thinking about a house. And he had lived in the city for a long time. And he didn't want to deal with parking anymore, which is completely valid. I mean, every day he lived over by the art museum, and every day it was like a race to find parking. Completely valid. But the issue that I had was that he asked me to come on all the tours with him, which, okay, objectively, that's not a huge deal. But he wanted me to weigh in on, do you like this house? Could you see yourself in this house? And it was a weird position for me because, I mean, I went along with it because I thought, well, that's what partners do. Again, I'm 25. I didn't have a lot of serious relationships. This was my first like multi-year relationship. And I was like, okay, this is what you do. You show up for your person's big life decisions. He ended up buying the house though. I'll kind of skip forward a bit. I mean, he ended up buying a house in my hometown. And it was okay. Like, it was not a terrible house or anything. It wasn't like my style because I didn't have skin in the game. We weren't engaged, and that's something that I wanted to do. Like, of course, you don't need to be engaged to buy a house with someone. But that was something that I personally wanted. And I felt like I didn't have any like more permanent kind of skin in the game. And I tried to talk with him about like, hey, why don't we get an apartment together? Let's live it together. Let's get one with parking in the city. Because I didn't want to move out of the city yet. I really was enjoying the city life. So anyway, it was like I tried having some of those discussions. But again, there wasn't anything like permanent in our relationship at that point. And to me, I wanted to be engaged or even just married before we bought a house. Then the math started to show up. And he mentioned to me that he eventually would want me to, well, he expected me to cover half of the deposit that he put in, half of the upgrades, half of the costs. Like basically everything was split. And while I appreciate equality, of course, and at that point we were splitting costs of dates and things like that, owing your future husband money is very strange and it felt really icky. He also didn't want to put me in the deed, which I thought was weird even after we got married. all of that was strange. So I started to feel like it's like a small sinking ship and we were not aligned on money, about what ours was, like what the definition of what ours means. It was like more about what he wanted. It wasn't really lining up. It hadn't been lining up for a while. Around the same stretch of time, my life was getting heavier in a different direction. I went through intensive ERP therapy for OCD, and that is exposure response prevention therapy. If you know, you know. It's one of the harder things you can put yourself through. It was very intense and brutal and transformative. And I also think, I put the work in. I also was very privileged to have access to very good and qualified professionals. And that's a whole other thing that I will talk about. But yeah, he showed up for me. He was there during my worst moments where I couldn't get out of bed. I was extremely depressed, extremely anxious. I wasn't on medication, but I was starting to get on medication, but not at all the right dosage. I was not interested in doing like hobbies or anything. He would cook dinner for me every night, and it was like he really showed up. So then like months later, as I started to gain more tools to manage my mental health a bit better, he got sick, was diagnosed with a form of Lyme disease, included multiple trips to the emergency room, different doctors, different food, diet, therapies, IVs, all this stuff. And suddenly, while I was working full time, I was also functioning as a caregiver for him. And that's when something shifted in me that I didn't quite have the name for it yet. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even really love in the way that I'd had described it prior. It was like close to a feeling of guilt, not guilt that he ever asked me to feel. I'll be very clear about that. Guilt that I built myself slowly, like brick by brick, because he had been there for me during by far the darkest chapters of my life. And this part of me decided that I like owed him my future. And I didn't give myself credit because I was the one that did the work in therapy. I was putting in a lot of really hard efforts to really face a lot of things that were making my life smaller and smaller. I was putting him on a pedestal. I started closely crediting him for my own healing. So while all this is happening, I moved into his house. It was a bit months later after he bought it and moved in and everything, because I had to time my lease in Philly and kind of iron all that stuff out. I told him that I would move in on the premise that we would get engaged within a year. He agreed to that timeline. 12 months came and he just kind of kept dragging his feet. When he proposed, there wasn't any getting down on one knee or saying my full name or things that I had wanted. I wasn't really someone who had this, I know what my wedding is going to be like when I was a little girl or anything like that. But I did at least think, and this is of course like more traditional, it was just something that I was like, you can't say my name. Like, you can't at least put some effort into this. I said yes, not because I was like overflowing with excitement. I felt I had this deep sense of wanting to be chosen because I'd absorbed that idea that this is what you do in your late 20s. You get this guy, you say yes, you move forward. But if I'm being completely honest about how my life actually felt in that stretch, it definitely wasn't expanding. It was shrinking. It was shrinking in ways that I couldn't quite articulate yet. And a ring wasn't going to fix that. Sometimes it just puts a name on the pressure that's already there. So a few months into wedding planning, his parents, unannounced, drove up from Florida and they stayed at the house for over a week. They rearranged things, did projects around the house that nobody asked for, and then complained about having done them, which is pretty funny looking back. I think they were just bored, but whatever. And I kept asking Jack, like, dude, we need to go out. Like, they're a lot. And we need to have, I'm someone who like gets crazy if I stay inside too much. During the weekend, we were just not doing much. And we got to go out. Like, we need us time. I'm not asking for much here. And he just kept saying, oh, I don't like, no, we can't, or I'll think about it. And then I would like bring it up again. And I'm like, dude, I'm asking for like, go down the street and get a coffee. We lived really close to this small town that had all these cute little coffee shops and restaurants and stuff. And I'm like, for like an hour. This is not a lot. Like, this is literally not a lot that I'm asking. And he was also feeling a lot better with his health. And he had been for quite some time and had done other social things. Then came the night that our parents were going to meet for the first time. And I was already unraveling before we even left the house. We had this big argument right before we left. And I just snapped. And his parents like heard us. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, something erupted in me because I was so frustrated. But we still went to the dinner, and I sat through that entire dinner completely checked out, running on autopilot just to get through it and the small talk. The next morning, I drove to my parents', which was like 10 minutes away, and my dad looked at me and asked if I was okay. I couldn't do it anymore. And I really could not lie to him. Like, of all people, I couldn't lie to my dad. And what I understand now is that my body and like my instinct had known long before my mind like finally caught up. But sitting in the living room of my parents' house, I finally couldn't physically take it anymore. And I had to let myself listen. I had to listen to myself. And literally an hour later, I broke off the engagement. I broke up entirely, not just the engagement. Like, I was like, I'm out of this. I'm done. And when I do something this big, I have to fully do it. Otherwise, I will rationally like come up with ways of not doing it, and then, rationalize it. And then I can't operate like that. This was very similar to what I would do a few years later, which is leaving the government, my government job for corporate. So yeah, I did it, and we broke up in outside this coffee shop that we used to go to all the time. And I moved back home. I started rebuilding from scratch, not from zero, but I rebuilt a lot of things. A few days later, that is where the story for this episode started. The cafeteria, the ring, walking back to my desk. The breakup too didn't end cleanly. After all of that came the financial fallout. Jack wanted wedding venue deposits back because we had found a wedding venue and we're starting to get a lot of that in order. We had about a year out. We were going to get married like the next year, but we had put deposits down, and he thought, in his mind, he thought he was the one that was more, I think he used the term, more of an injured party. So he was like, I should get the full amount back. And we're talking thousands of dollars. I was like, no way, dude. I actually listed out all like financials and the rent that I had paid for over a year when I lived there. I like contributed, which is fair. And then the bills that I had covered. We got a new water heater in his house. There were other household things. And when I laid it side by side with what he was asking for, the whole shape of the relationship really became more visible to me in a way that it had never before. And it was less about money per se. I mean, it is about money, but it's more about control and power and an imbalance in power, and how that imbalance had been shaping every decision underneath the surface the entire time. I didn't want to owe my future husband money. Like, that's just not cute. That's not romantic. It's not sexy. That's controlling. And I absolutely despise that. So from the outside, that relationship looked stable. Steady person, like career-wise, homeowner, 5 years ahead in his career. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to tell the difference between stable and right for me. Those two things aren't the same. And nobody warns you how similar they can feel from the inside. It was never one single red flag. It really never is, unless it's like really, really catastrophic. It was about power dynamics, pressure from family, money that didn't add up, caregiving on top of feelings of guilt, two people that were quietly building from two completely different blueprints, and only one of us really noticing. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I started shrinking myself and calling it compromise. That's the story how I almost got married back in 2019. Here's the thing that nobody really talks about: how much overlap there is between who you are at work and who you are at home. You don't get to be decisive and analytical and willing to push back in a design review and then become a completely different person the second you walk through your own house. The instincts you choose to use to troubleshoot a broken system at work are the same ones you eventually have to use to troubleshoot your own life. Mine just took longer to switch on outside the office. And let me make something very, very clear. Walking away wasn't some clean, cinematic moment out of a movie of clarity. It was messy. It shook my confidence while also boosted it at the same time, even while some part of me knew it was the right call. Like, I knew in my bones that it was the right call. And something that my therapist had once told me when I was deep in intensive therapy, it was something along the lines of, it's going to be hard if you stay and keep operating the way that you've always been operating. And it's also going to be hard if you choose to do something different and unknown. So it's hard no matter what path you take. So you might as well pick the version that is actually good for you and going to give you more of a healthy life. So that has always really stuck with me. The aftermath wasn't neat either. I didn't leave and immediately land in some enlightened, healed version of myself. It was lonely. I spent a lot of time alone. I mean, I had already lived alone, but it was having someone that you see every night and to then not, it gets lonely. But I would rather have been lonely than to be in a relationship that I'm not happy in. It was also chaotic. It involved the absolute dumpster fire that is online dating. Some questionable choices, absolutely. A lot of detours and a lot of learning things along the way. And that's a whole other episode. The twists, the turns, I can't believe I'm doing this era. Like, literally, I felt like, did I just do that? Did I just blow up my life? Or did I dodge a bullet, or both? I had those thoughts every single day. Which actually brings me to why I wanted to tell this story in the first place. Because the truth is, None of us learn this stuff in a vacuum. We learn it from watching each other, hearing what other people went through and thinking, oh, okay, that happened to someone else too. So if you've ever been the only woman in a room full of men and somehow still ended up being the most level-headed adult in all of it, at work, at home, or both, I want to hear about it. The meeting that went sideways, the coworker meltdown, the moment that you thought, wait, hold up, this cannot be real life. Leave a comment or call the STEM podcast hotline, which is 267-281-3633, and tell me your workplace life story. Ask for advice. I will try my best to answer it just based on my own experiences. I think I've mentioned this in some of the other episodes, I'm starting to plan guests that I'm going to be having on the podcast. And I want to make sure that this is not just me saying, my vision for this podcast is to be more story based, because I personally feel like I've learned a lot from what others people's stories are versus a step-by-step guidebook of just follow these steps and expect some outcome. I don't feel like that always works. But at the same time, I want this to be a conversation, and I want, if you're moved to ask a question or ask for advice, I will give you my thoughts and my perspective just based on my own experience. And then having guests on will also I always like having multiple perspectives. I think that can be really helpful because everyone's situation is so unique to themselves. And with your permission, of course, it could end up in a future episode. So if you're into stories about navigating careers, workplace chaos, and the parts of life nobody quite prepares you for, follow the podcast so you don't miss out on the next one. Until then, keep questioning the outdated advice we never asked for, but somehow absorbed anyway. And thank you if you're still here. Thank you so much for listening. This really means a lot to me.